The stars outside the viewport had not changed. They never did. But everything else had. Commander Leon Hart stood at the front of the bridge of the EFS Resolute and watched the tactical display with the kind of stillness that only comes from being too tired to panic. 6 hours. They had been fighting for 6 hours straight, and the Keth Armada was still out there, still pressing, still pushing against what was left of humanity's orbital defense line like a fist against a paper door. The Resolute was a carrier, one of the biggest ships humanity had ever built. Right now it felt very small. Lieutenant Nina Calloway was at her sensor station on the lower deck, her fingers moving fast across the controls even though her eyes were red from the hours of strain. She was 26 years old and this was the largest battle she had ever seen. She had not eaten since the previous shift. There had not been time. 3 of humanity's 7 carrier groups were gone. The EFS Cardinal had taken a direct hit to her reactor core 2 hours ago and simply stopped existing. The Galway and her escort ships had been forced to pull back behind the moon after losing 60% of hull integrity. What remained was bleeding, slow, and running out of everything that mattered. Admiral George Ferris came through on the fleet-wide channel. His voice was steady. Leon had always respected that about the old man. He did not sugarcoat things, and he did not pretend that. He told them plainly that they were outnumbered 4-1. He told them ammunition reserves across the fleet were sitting at 18%. He told them no reinforcements were coming. Earth had nothing left to send. What they had was what they had, and their job was to hold the line until they physically could not hold it anymore. Nobody on the Resolute said anything for a moment after the channel closed, then the ship shuddered as a Keth plasma burst clipped the port side and 2 hull alarm lights turned red on the damage board. Chief Engineer Bart Doyle's voice came up from the lower decks, calm and dry, saying he was on it. Bart was always on it. Leon did not know what he would do without the man. Nina spoke up from her station. Her voice was careful, like someone not sure if they were about to say something smart or something embarrassing. She said she was picking up an anomalous reading. Far out. Past the outer marker buoys, well beyond the edge of the active battlefield. A gravitational distortion that did not match any of the background readings from the start of the engagement. The senior navigation officer, a broad-shouldered man named Craig Dutton, glanced over at her screen and told her it was a sensor ghost. The battle noise alone was enough to generate false readings all day long. He had seen it happen before. Nina did not argue. She made a note in her log and kept watching it. Outside, the Keth Armada was moving. The tactical display showed their formation shifting, tightening, pulling together into the kind of dense configuration that preceded a hard push. They had done this twice before in the last 6 hours. Both times it had cost humanity ships. Leon watched the display and said nothing. He did not pray. He did not make speeches. He just kept his eyes on the screen and thought about how much ammunition they had left and whether the Resolute's engines could give him one more hard burn if he needed to reposition fast. That he thought about the city below. About the lights on the surface that were probably still on. About the people who did not know how close the line had come. Nina was still watching her anomaly. The Keth completed their formation shift. On the display, their armada looked like a closed hand. They were getting ready to hit hard again, and this time Leon was not sure the line would hold. That he gave the order to tighten defensive formation and redistribute power to the forward shields. Around him, the crew moved without hesitation. Whatever fear they had tucked it away somewhere and gotten back to work. Leon thought that was probably the most human thing he had ever seen. The anomaly at the edge of the system did not move, not yet. Nina Calloway did not let it go. The anomaly was still there 40 minutes later, sitting at the edge of the system like a word someone had written in fog. It had not moved. It had not grown stronger. It had not faded. It just sat there, quiet and patient, in the sensor noise of a battlefield where nobody had time to look at it. She pulled up the data a second time and cross-referenced it against the known gravitational baseline for that sector. The distortion was small but consistent. Too consistent for interference. Random battle noise was messy, chaotic, full of spikes and drops. This was smooth. Steady. Like something was working very hard to hold a shape. She flagged Senior Sensor Chief Dale Ortega. Dale was a careful man by nature. He was the kind of person who checked a number twice before he said it out loud. and who never used the word certain unless he actually was. He came over to Nina's station with the expression of someone who expected to spend 30 seconds confirming a ghost and then get back to his own board that he did not spend 30 seconds on it, that he spent 20 minutes. He pulled up his own sensor tools, ran 2 independent calibration checks to make sure the equipment was clean, and then sat back in his chair with a look on his face that Nina had not seen before. She had worked alongside Dale for 11 months. She had seen him annoyed, focused, and occasionally pleased with himself. She had never seen him pale, that he said it was not a ghost, the distortion had a shape. Deep beneath the background noise, there was a structure to it, a controlled, deliberate energy field maintaining a specific boundary. Something was hiding there. Something big enough that the gravitational effect was measurable at this distance. It had been sitting at the edge of the system for an unknown amount of time, completely still, pointed toward the battlefield, and generating no signal of any kind. Dr. Cora Prentice was a civilian. She was a xenophysicist who had been attached to the fleet 8 months ago to study captured Keth technology, and she spent most of her time in a lab 2 decks below the bridge that smelled like solder and old coffee. She was not a soldier and had no desire to be one. But when Nina sent her the data file and asked her to take a look, she came up to the bridge fast. She studied the energy signature for a long time without saying anything. The battle continued around them. Another volley from the Keth hit something on the port side of the fleet, and the lights on the Resolute flickered for 2 seconds before the backup systems caught up. Cora said the signature did not match Keth technology. She said it with the kind of quiet certainty that comes from knowing a subject deeply. Then she said it did not match human technology either. Then she said she had checked it against every catalogued alien energy signature in the xenographic database, all 14 entries including 2 that were theoretical reconstructions from debris analysis, and it did not match any of them, whatever was at the edge of the system. It was not something humanity had ever seen before. Nina suggested sending a contact signal. Dale was hesitant but did not say no. They used tight beam, which would not broadcast to the rest of the battlefield, and they transmitted the standard universal contact protocol, a sequence of mathematical primes followed by a basic harmonic pattern that, in theory, any intelligence capable of building a starship would recognize as deliberate communication. The distortion did not respond. It did not move. It sat exactly where it had been sitting, unchanged. Leon Hart listened to all of this with the expression of a man who had too many problems and had just been handed one more. He did not dismiss it. To his credit, he never dismissed things that his crew brought to him with evidence. But he also had a battle to manage, and the Keth were tightening their formation again. That he reported the anomaly to Admiral Ferris, who was in the middle of coordinating a desperate counter-push against the Keth's left flank. Ferris told him to keep watching it and flag any change immediately, then went back to his battle. It was a reasonable decision. There was nothing else to do. The Keth completed their formation shift. Leon looked at the tactical display and felt something he did not often feel, a cold, clear-eyed awareness that the next 20 minutes were going to decide everything. That he gave his orders. The crew responded. The Resolute took a direct hit 7 minutes later. A Keth heavy cannon round, moving at a speed that made the impact feel almost instantaneous, punched through the outer hull on Deck 4 and Deck 5 and turned both of them into open space. The blast knocked people off their feet across the whole ship. An ensign named Pete Callahan hit his head on a console and was unconscious for 6 minutes. Nobody had time to check on him properly until later. On her sensor board, Nina watched the anomaly and held her breath. It still had not moved, but something, some instinct she could not name, told her that it was watching. It chose the worst possible moment. Or maybe the best. Nina would think about that for a long time afterward. The Keth had pushed their final assault wave with everything they had left. 3 human carriers were adrift, spinning slowly in the dark with their lights going in and out. The EFS Caldwell had lost her engines and was drifting toward the moon at a speed that was going to become a problem in about 4 hours. 2 destroyers had simply stopped answering hails. The Resolute had taken 2 more hits since the one that opened up decks 4 and 5, and Bart Doyle had stopped giving Leon damage reports because there were too many of them and the list kept growing. The line was breaking. Leon could see it on the tactical display. Not all at once, not in a single dramatic collapse, but in the way that real things break under real pressure, a little at a time, each small failure making the next one more likely. and then the anomaly moved. Nina saw it first. Her board lit up with a proximity alarm and she almost knocked her coffee over calling out the change. Dale spun to his own station. Cora, who had been sitting against the wall with her data tablet, stood up so fast she dropped it. The distortion was moving. Not toward the Keth. Not toward Earth. It moved to the center of the battlefield, to the open space between the two fleets where nothing lived, and it stopped, and then it let go of its cloak. What came out of the shimmer of dissolving stealth field was enormous. That was the first word that came to Nina's mind, and it stayed there because nothing else quite covered it. The ship was long and dark, with a shape that did not match any aesthetic humanity had ever produced. Parts of it looked almost organic, curved and layered like something that had grown rather than been built. Other parts were brutally angular, hard lines and flat surfaces that spoke of machinery and purpose. There was no obvious front or back for a moment, until the thing rotated slightly and its orientation became clear from the way its systems were arranged that it was bigger than the Keth flagships. It was bigger than anything human. It sat in the middle of the battlefield and it did not broadcast, did not signal, did not move. It simply existed, and its existence was enough. Every ship on both sides stopped firing, the guns went quiet. The Keth plasma cannons, which had been cycling so fast they had developed a rhythm that the Resolute's crew had started to unconsciously track, stopped. The human point defense systems, which had been running on automatic for 6 hours, spun down to standby. Missiles that had already been launched were the only thing still moving in the whole battle space. 10 seconds of silence on every communication channel simultaneously. Nina counted them. She was watching the Keth formation when she noticed it. The edges were shifting. Not into an attack posture, not into a defensive spread. The ships at the outer edges of the Keth armada were pulling back, creating distance between themselves and the unknown vessel. It was subtle, maybe 300 kilometers of drift over the course of a few seconds, but she knew what she was looking at. She had grown up watching enough nature programs to recognize the behavior. They were not confused. They were afraid. She said it out loud. She said, "The Keth know what this ship is." Cora picked her tablet up from the floor and stared at her data with the expression of someone whose theory had just become very uncomfortably real. She said quietly that the Keth had not expected this ship to be here. Whatever history existed between these two civilizations, the Keth had not planned for this possibility when they chose to come to this star system. The unknown ship broadcast a signal. It hit every frequency at once, not a targeted transmission but a blanket emission that touched every receiver in the entire battle space simultaneously. Dale and Cora both lunged for their analysis tools. It was not language. It was not a mathematical sequence. It was not a standard contact protocol. It was something that sat between music and physics, a structured pattern that seemed to carry meaning without using symbols. It lasted for 11 seconds. Dale and Cora worked in silence for almost 2 minutes, cross-referencing it against everything they had. Then Cora looked up and said it was the closest thing to a warning she could imagine, but also something more than that. Like a declaration. Like something standing up and saying, "I am here. I see what is happening. And I have made a decision." On the tactical display, the unknown ship began to rotate. Its bow came around slowly, deliberately, until it was pointed directly at the Keth armada. Leon Hart watched it happen and felt something shift in his chest that he could not immediately name. It took him a few seconds to identify that it was hope. He had almost forgotten what it felt like. The unknown ship did not waste time. Its weapons fired once, and then again, and then it was simply in continuous operation. And what it did to the Keth ships was something that none of the human crew watching from the Resolute could fully describe afterward. It was not a beam. It was not a projectile. It was something that reached out toward its targets and interacted with them at a level that looked almost personal, like the weapon was having an argument with the molecular structure of whatever it touched. Keth hull plating buckled inward without anything visibly striking it. Keth shields, which had been absorbing human fire all morning, did not seem to know what to do with whatever was hitting them now. 2 Keth destroyers came apart in the first 40 seconds. Not in explosions, but in a way that was almost quiet, a slow structural failure that started somewhere inside and worked outward until the ships stopped being ships. The Keth did not run. That was the part that Leon Hart found himself respecting even as he was watching them lose. The Keth were afraid of the unknown ship, he had seen it in their formation shift when it decloaked, but they did not break. They regrouped fast, pulling their strongest vessels forward and committing to a counter-assault. They went after the unknown ship with everything remaining in their arsenal, wave after wave of plasma fire and torpedo spreads and close-range attack runs from their smaller craft. The unknown ship was managing it. But managing was not the same as easy. Keth torpedoes were getting through the outer defense envelope, and there were a lot of them. Leon made the call without asking Admiral Ferris for permission. He did not wait to think about it or calculate the risk or weigh the diplomatic implications of a human warship flying formation with a vessel that had never identified itself. He just looked at the situation, looked at his crew, and gave the order. The Resolute accelerated toward the unknown ship's starboard flank, where a swarm of Keth attack craft were trying to press an advantage in the blind spot created by the angle of the big vessel's fire. Point defense cannons came alive. Missiles launched. The Resolute put herself between the Keth attack craft and the unknown ship's flank and started doing what she was built to do. Captain Daria Solis of the EFS Iron Veil did not need to be asked. She had watched the Resolute break formation and had already started her own intercept burn before the Resolute had even finished accelerating. Daria was the kind of officer who read a situation fast and trusted her reading of it, and what she read was simple. The biggest friendly asset on the battlefield needed cover, and cover was something she could provide. The Iron Veil came in hard on the unknown ship's port side and opened up with everything she had. 3 more surviving human ships followed within 90 seconds. They moved as a unit without a single order passing between them, slotting into positions around the unknown ship as if they had drilled for this, as if humanity had always known this day would come and had prepared for it in some deep instinctive way. The unknown ship's communication system activated again. This time it was different. The signal that came through was still rough, still clearly being assembled in real time from something other than a natural command of the language, but it was in English. Broken English, with pauses in strange places and word choices that were slightly off in a way that did not feel like poor translation but like a mind that organized meaning differently than a human mind did. The transmission said, "You hold. We will finish." Nina was already at the transmitter. She did not ask Leon for permission either, because she was 26 years old and running on no sleep and something in her chest had caught fire when she heard that voice come through. She transmitted back on the same frequency, "We hold together." There was a pause of about 4 seconds, then the unknown ship seemed to change its approach. It angled slightly, creating a better firing line while also drawing the densest part of the Keth counter-assault away from the most damaged human vessels. It was protecting them. Not just fighting alongside them, but actively adjusting its tactics to reduce the pressure on the ships that were already hurting. It had understood what Nina said. The tide shifted in the next 20 minutes. Not all at once, but steadily, each exchange going slightly more in the combined fleet's favor than the last. Keth ships began to fall back toward the outer system, first the smaller vessels, then the mid-range ships, until only the Keth flagships were still holding their positions. The Keth flagship held for a long time. It was enormous and well-armed, and its commander was not someone who surrendered ground easily. It took concentrated fire from the unknown ship and 3 human carriers simultaneously to finally convince it to begin pulling back. When it went, the rest of the armada went with it. Not in a rout, not in panic, but in the controlled withdrawal of a force that had decided this engagement was no longer worth the cost. The guns went quiet again. This time they stayed quiet. The battlefield was quiet in the way that only a battlefield can be quiet, full of wreckage and floating debris and the slow tumble of things that used to be ships, but empty of the sounds that had filled the last 7 hours. No cannon fire. No proximity alarms. No voices calling out damage reports with that particular tight quality that voices get when the person speaking is trying very hard not to show fear. Just quiet. The Resolute drifted in formation with what remained of the human fleet, her hull scored and patched and scored again, her crew sitting or standing at their stations with the specific exhaustion of people who had given everything they had and were only now beginning to understand that they might actually get to keep living. The unknown ship sat in the center of it all. It had not moved since the Keth withdrew. It had not attempted contact. It had not turned back toward the edge of the system. It was simply present, patient, waiting with the same stillness it had shown before the battle, as if waiting were something it had a great deal of practice with. Bart Doyle sent up a damage summary that went on for 2 pages. Leon read it without expression and handed it to his executive officer to begin coordinating repairs. Then he looked at the tactical display and at the unknown ship sitting motionless in the debris field, and he thought for a long moment. Admiral Ferris opened a channel to the entire surviving fleet. His voice was rougher than it had been at the start of the day, scraped down by hours of hard commands and one bad hit that had cracked 2 of his ribs, though he had not mentioned that to anyone. He addressed the unknown ship directly, on all frequencies, in the plain voice of a man who did not know how to be anything other than what he was. He said thank you. He said it without ceremony and without the kind of formal language that politicians used. He said his people had been close to the end and that the ship's arrival had changed that, and that whatever the crew of that vessel was, wherever they had come from, humanity owed them a debt that he was not sure how to measure. He stopped talking and waited. The response came after about 30 seconds. The same voice as before, still rough and assembled sounding, still with those strange pauses and word choices that felt like meaning being translated through a process that was not quite language. It said the Keth had been moving through this region of space for a long time. That Earth was not the first world they had targeted. That there had been others before, some of which had not survived the encounter. The unknown ship and its people had been following the Keth armada, tracking their movements, waiting. Nina asked the question before she had consciously decided to ask it. She asked why they had waited so long. She asked why they had sat at the edge of the system and watched the battle nearly be lost before they came in. The response took longer this time. Long enough that Nina wondered if she had asked something offensive or something that did not translate, or something that had no answer. Then voice said, "We needed to see what you were." Leon understood without asking for explanation. He looked at Nina and she looked back at him and he could see in her face that she understood too. They had not just been watching the battle. They had been watching humanity. Watching how humans fought when they were losing. Watching whether they broke, whether they ran, whether they turned on each other when the pressure got bad enough. Watching what humans did with the last of their ammunition and the last of their hull integrity and the last of any reasonable hope. They had been deciding whether humanity was worth standing beside. Cora Prentice asked, in her careful scientist's voice, who they were. She said it gently, like someone who knew the answer might be more than they were ready for. Voice gave a name in its own language. It was a sound that came through the communications system as a sequence that had no equivalent in any human alphabet, a thing of harmonics and timing that a human throat could not have produced. It lasted about 2 seconds, then voice added, "But you may call us what you like." Dale Ortega had been sitting at his sensor station for 7 hours. He had not slept. He had survived a battle that should have killed everyone on this ship. He was wearing a bandage on his left hand from a console that had exploded during the second major hit. He was not a diplomat or a philosopher or a first contact specialist. He said, "Then we will call you neighbors." There was a silence that lasted long enough to make Nina think the transmission had cut out. Then voice said, "Yes. Neighbors." Something changed on the sensor board. The unknown ship's weapon systems, which had been sitting in a hot standby state since the battle ended, began to power down. The energy signature of its outer hull shifted, dropping from the sharp, aggressive profile of a ship at combat readiness to something quieter, lower, less like a raised fist and more like an open hand. Nina watched it happen on her display. She watched the reading settle into something that no human sensor array had ever recorded before, the energy signature of an unknown vessel choosing, deliberately, to stand down. She let out a breath that she had been holding, on and off, for 7 hours, outside the viewport, past the floating wreckage of a battle that Earth had come within minutes of losing. The unknown ship sat in orbit beside the battered human fleet. The stars behind it were the same stars they had always been. They never changed, but everything else had.